Welcome to today's virtual professional learning session, Developing Culturally Responsive Social Science Lessons, Aligning Teaching Practices with Oregon's 2024 Social Science Standards. We're grateful that you're joining us today and are excited to work together to strengthen your understanding of culturally responsive teaching in the social sciences. So we'll go ahead to the next slide. Thank you. I'm one of your hosts. I'm Crystal Charity, a senior subject matter specialist for West Ed. And prior to graduate school, where I did my research focused on the design and implementation of K through 12 ethnic studies programs, I taught high school level world history and ethnic studies in Oakland, California.
Awesome. And my name is Jackie Pang. I'm one of the co-directors of the Oregon Social Science Project at West Ed, and I taught secondary social studies for 10 years in Maryland public schools, everything from sociology to U.S. history to AP World History. And I also led school-based professional learning and worked with pre-service early childhood and elementary educators at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, where I earned my PhD. So super excited to be with, hopefully, a lot of educators this evening to talk to you about these awesome new standards.
Thank you, Jackie. Now we'll hand it over to Amit and Rebecca to introduce themselves and speak a little bit more to the purpose of this professional learning series and ODE's role in it.
Great. Vanessa, you want to say hello?
Yeah, I just want to say hello. Hi, everybody. I'm Vanessa Martinez, and I'm the Director of Standards and Instructional Support. And so the social sciences are nested on my beautiful team, and just really thrilled to be in the company of teachers. I'm also a former teacher, high school, but language arts, but worked very closely with my social science counterparts in a humanities block, and just really thrilled about our new standards and making sense of them here in this space with you all. So thank you for taking the time this afternoon.
Thank you. Rebecca, you want to say hello?
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rebecca Barr. I am the Ethnic Studies, Genocide, Holocaust and Genocide Program Analyst at the Department of Education, and I'm very pleased to be here with all of you this afternoon.
Okay,
Thank
thank
you.
you. And I'm Amit Kabrowski. I'm the social science specialist at ODE. Before joining ODE, I was in the Beaverton School District for about 25 years, and came over to ODE to uh, some exciting times in social science with lots of changes happening, including ultimately these new social science standards. So we're really glad that you're here with us today, and in our kind of second professional learning on the new social science standards. These standards are so much more than just a routine update that we usually do every 7 years, but they have a new format. There's a much more inclusive approach to what students are learning about social science. We're integrating all the new legislation that's been passed since 2017, and then the creation of professional learning opportunities. So these virtual learning opportunities, this is number two. We have two more to coming up. And then we've just came out of Pendleton where we did in-person professional learning, and then we have a couple more coming up. So if you haven't signed up yet, there's opportunities in Clackamas and Bend and Eugene at the end of this month, as well in the beginning of May. And then once all the trainings are done, there'll be some asynchronous trainings available through our Canvas modules on some of the deeper dives on topics that are covered in the standards. So really glad that you're here and excited to pass it off to West Ed to sort of take you through some learning today. And hopefully you can join us in upcoming events.
Thank you so much, Amit. Before we get into the rest of the session, we wanted to cover some norms of co-engagement with you. To create a generative and enriching environment, we ask that you respect the time and the structure of the session, allow space for equitable participation, engage in curiosity-led discussions, and demonstrate mutual respect for each other. We'll hold ourselves to these same expectations. The norms will be particularly relevant during our breakout sessions later in, or discussions, excuse me, later out in the session. The entire session is definitely designed to be interactive, so please be prepared to actively participate. We want to hear from you. Not only do we believe you'll learn more by engaging deeply with the questions and activities, but we are sure that your insights will bolster your colleagues' learning as well. We look forward to collaboratively thinking through your ideas, your questions, your examples. And then also want to take a moment to address questions. We hope the session will generate questions for you. We expect that they will. As educators, we know that new learning always invites new inquiries, right? So more questions can come up than we even had before the session. If and when questions arise for you, please just drop those in the chat. We might not have time to address every question during the session, but anything that does not get answered, we'll have colleagues tracking those questions, and we'll be able to answer those and address those and send out a frequently asked document later to make sure that everything is addressed, whether here or then. All right. We also want to take a moment to learn a bit more about who is in the room with us today. And in the chat, we ask that you can please share the role that you have in education and the region in which you work. So if you don't mind pulling up the chat and sharing your role, your job within education, and the region in which you work. Museum staff, teacher educators, program manager. Oh, Abby, I think we featured some of your work in our resource hub, Abby. Language development, high school teachers, instructional coaches. Yay. All right, awesome. Okay, now I'm going to attempt to walk people through technology. So we'll see how that goes. Well, luckily we have a lot of folks on the chat who can also help. Okay, and then another liaison. All right, so the other thing we want to do is to have a visual of what regions that you're all coming from. So you should see on the left-hand side of your screen a green pencil, just like the one in the screenshot, that allows you to annotate. If you don't see it automatically, you can kind of do a little mouse over on the left side and you will see the annotation button. And then when you hit that, the little green pencil, you should be able to see an annotation bar on the left corner. And there should be an opportunity for a stamp. It's like a check mark, and you could place it there. And other people are not as tech challenged because they were doing it during my slow explanation. I'm glad you're able to find the star. If anyone else needs it, you can find the green pencil on the left-hand side. Okay. Thank you all for sharing in the chat, for marking up the map, giving us that visual. All right. Thank you. As you can see, you could hear, we represent a wide range of educational positions and regions in Oregon. And you'll notice that throughout, understanding your local context will be pretty important to the discussions we have here today, but of course to the work that you will be doing as well. All of that will be very different depending on the folks that you work with, the communities that you work in. So another thing I would like to ask from you is that we take a moment to rename ourselves in Zoom. So we'll go ahead and switch the slide to those directions, if you don't mind. Thank you. All right, so we have the directions right here for you, but I can help you out with that as well. In the bottom toolbar of the meeting window, if you can select participants, hover over your own name and select the option for more. You'll see the option rename, and you can add either K through 5 or 6 to 12 to the beginning of your name. We really appreciate that. That'll help us place you into the correct breakout group later when we do some grade band specific work. Thank you, Nicole, and welcome. Great, I see some folks that have already added either K through 5. Well, I see K 12, some do K through 12. Right, great. So just wait for a few others. We have some K through 12, 9 through 12. I love the K through 12. We might be able to use you flexibly later when we need to create our groups. All right. Thank you so much. If anyone hasn't done it, we'll give you some time to do it, but I want to take us through an overview of the virtual professional learning series next. As you can see, we're on the second in a series of 4 professional learning opportunities. The first session was held March 19th and 20th, and it served as a deep dive into Oregon's 2024 social science standards. And we'll be providing a link to that recording later. It is important to know that we'll also be recording this session. We've already started recording, but it's only the content where we are presenting. So this means that when we are in breakout groups, those will not be recorded. And any comments that you make in this whole group discussion, if you go on mute and you share with us, those will be edited out. And we're doing that to honor your privacy and the confidentiality of that space. Moving along, the next future sessions are session 3 and 4. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said the trigger phrase. Moving on. The session 3 and 4 will be held April 9th and 10th, and then on April 16th and 17th. And so if you're interested in, and we hope you are, learning more about differentiating instruction for diverse learners in social science and using primary source analysis to do so, and how to facilitate meaningful historical conversation in the social sciences, we encourage you to register for and attend these 2 sessions. I think it would really enhance, you'll see the work we're doing today, and then you'll see that it will really enhance that and just deepen your knowledge. So I definitely recommend that. And that will bring me to session 2's learning goals. So after this session, we really hope that you are able to implement grade-appropriate, culturally responsive teaching practices aligned with Oregon's 2024 social science standards, to design lessons that incorporate resources with diverse perspectives, and integrate contemporary issues with historical content and context, such as the civil rights movements, Japanese incarceration, and LGBTQTSIA+ rights. Throughout this session, we will demonstrate explicit connections between culturally responsive teaching practices, the 2024 social science standards, and essential disciplinary practices. We know everyone is at different places in their comfort around creating, teaching, and assessing culturally responsive social science lessons. We do not expect anyone to go from novice to expert in one professional learning session or even series, but we do hope that each of you expands your understanding and builds on your current toolkit by the end of this session. And that brings me to the agenda and what we're aiming to do here today. We've just completed welcomes and introductions. Next, we would lead through the key revisions and social science standards, cover culturally responsive teaching in the social sciences, and model activities around our first theme, expanding the narrative model activities. Then we'll take a brief break, get some stretching, some relaxation, and get ready for the lesson demonstrations. And that's when we're in our breakout groups and covering change makers in history. And as I mentioned earlier, those breakout rooms will be based on grade band that you work with in order to try to personalize to what you'll be doing in the classroom or in your support with teachers and educators. And then we will close out with reflection, additional resources, and a brief survey. We really value your feedback, and we appreciate you if you just take those few minutes at the end and do the survey. So that's really how we can improve our offerings and better support you. We really want to hear directly from Oregon educators to make sure that we're giving you the kind of content and support that you need. And I'll end with the participant workbook. So this is kind of the end of our introduction. We will have a link for you in the chat to ensure that you are able to access this. The participant workbook accompanies this session. The idea is that you'll have a guide with a table of content, links to resources, note-taking space, and discussion prompts. And then throughout, you can keep track of your notes. You can access all of these rich resources later. And just, we ask that you save a copy to your drive or download it as a Word document, because when you open it, you'll notice that it does ask you to create a new document. And so you'll be able to keep it open and use it as I described during the session, and then reference it long after the session has ended. And then for now, I will pass it over to Jackie. She'll talk a little bit about key revisions in the standards.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Crystal. So we will go through this part relatively quickly, but not too quick. And that's because if you were able to join our first session, you may already be familiar with this information or any of the informational webinars that ODE hosted earlier in the year. Again, all of that information will be available for you on the web pages that are being created as a part of this project, and should be available to you later this spring. So let's talk about Oregon's vision for the revised social science standards. As Amit mentioned at the top of our session, there have been some significant revisions to the 2024 standards since their last iteration. That includes, for example, integrating ethnic studies, Holocaust, genocide, and tribal history, shared history concepts. And integrating these concepts throughout the 2024 standards reflects the state's commitment to providing students with a more complete and accurate understanding of historical and contemporary society. So the standards weave diverse perspectives and experiences and contributions into K-12 learning to help students develop a deeper understanding of the individuals and groups that have shaped and continue to influence our world, as well as Oregon on a very local level. So, students examine the complexity and influences of social structures on historical events and on modern society, while also building their critical thinking skills and cultural awareness. The standards integrated approach to social science supports students in becoming informed and engaged citizens in a pluralistic democracy. And so, by examining multiple perspectives and, for example, analyzing examples of discrimination and resistance and understanding the cultural contributions of diverse groups, students are able to develop the knowledge and analytical skills that they need to understand the past and navigate the present, as well as to imagine their futures. And so the integration of all these things helps, again, create a more inclusive and equitable learning environment where all students can see not only their histories represented, but also see histories and perspectives of other students and communities who may differ from them quite significantly. Um, so what does it mean to have an inclusive social science approach and to expand the narrative? The social science standards represent an approach that ensures that student learning experiences remain at the heart of instruction. And so when we talk about expanding the narrative within a framework of inclusive social science, it means including traditionally underrepresented groups of people into the curriculum, and into the standards. So underrepresented, that term is defined by ODE as the absence of the history, contributions, and perspectives of individuals and groups in the traditional approach to social studies, and or within previous social science textbooks. So, as legislated in House Bills 2845 and 2905, this underrepresented category is comprised of 16 groups, which, if you follow the link to the social science standards in your workbook, you'll be able to see all of those 16 groups listed out in the link to the standards. It's on page 8 of the standards. And much like the question around developmental appropriateness, the creators of the standards have thought really deeply about the challenge of not only including 16 groups in the standards, but also doing so in a developmentally appropriate way. So, exposing students to experiences and histories of people who are not of the same background is important to them, and making sure that we're doing that in a way that's inclusive, and allowing students to see different perspectives of others who may not share their same lived experiences is something that's really quite important. Another thing that we want to highlight quickly are some of the essential disciplinary practices and underrepresented group fact sheets. So if we go to the next slide. Awesome. These are some of the resources that are being created and are actually available for you to start looking through. Again, they are linked in the workbook. So if you haven't already clicked on that link that's in the chat and created a copy of this, I would encourage you to do that so that you're able to access some of these additional resources on page 2 of the workbook. So before we dive in today to looking at the standards and how they're different from previous iterations of the standards, we want to make sure that everyone has access to those key resources. Again, they have been dropped into the chat. There are additional resources that are available for you. So for example, the standards crosswalks are a part of the resources. They will be made available also on the web page that I mentioned earlier. That will be shared and will be live late spring, early summer. So looking ahead, we're also working on a series of online modules to support the implementation of the new standards, as well as a dedicated resource site. While these resources aren't ready just yet, you will be getting more information from ODE as soon as they're available. So let's go ahead and take a closer look now at the standards and see how they've evolved since 2021. So I'll use a think aloud approach to walk through the shift that has taken place from 2021 to the 2024 iteration of the standards. So first, here's the 2021 standard, and this is just an example. It says, identify how systems of power affect the perspectives of different individuals and groups when examining an event, issue, or problem with an emphasis on multiple perspectives. So this standard focuses on systems of power, how they shape perspectives and influence how people experience events. And it really encourages students to examine different viewpoints and recognize the role that power plays in shaping narratives. So now let's look at the 2024 revision. And it says, describe how individuals and groups in the local community and region have functioned as change makers for equity, equality, and freedom against bias, discrimination, racism, and oppression. So here you can see that the focus shifts from analyzing systems of power to examining the actions of individuals and groups who have worked to challenge those systems, right? Notice that emphasis on change makers, including local change makers, which has been bolded in the new 2024 standard. So it's still addressing discrimination, but with a stronger emphasis on agency and change making. So one effective strategy for teaching this updated standard would be to have students, for example, research and present on a local change maker or local change makers, someone in their community or in their region who has worked for equity and justice. This not only makes learning personal, but it also helps students to see history as something that's active and ongoing rather than something to just be studied in the past. So this shift in focus from systems of power to the people who challenge them reinforces the importance of civic engagement, something that is also really core and central to social science instruction, and the idea that history isn't just about what's happened, but how people continue to shape it. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Crystal, who's going to start to talk about a culturally responsive approach to teaching social sciences.
Yeah, thank you so much. So um, just jump right in. Thank you again, Jackie. So building on what Jackie shared, we'll now explore how culturally responsive teaching is integrated into social science concepts through both Oregon's updated social science standards and its essential disciplinary practices. But first, I want to step back for a moment and talk about what culturally responsive teaching is. According to theorist and scholar Geneva Gay, culturally responsive teaching is an approach that centers students' lived experiences, perspectives, and cultures into their learning in a way that makes the content both relevant and deepens the connections that students have to what they are learning. And although culture has been defined in myriad ways by myriad people, We personally are using culture to mean the customs, languages, values, and beliefs of a group of people, and know that culture determines how individuals and groups see and understand the world. Culturally responsive teaching builds students' understanding of their self and communities. It honors students' ways of being and unique strengths, perspectives, and contributions, and nurtures cross-cultural understanding by offering windows into other people's experiences, particularly those from historically underrepresented groups, which, as Jackie mentioned, is a big focus in the new 2024 social science standards. It also provides students with opportunities to reflect upon and understand the root causes of biases, stereotypes, prejudice, discrimination, and it encourages educators to consider the impact of the broader society and learning environment on students' behavior and their self-image. So how do the 2024 Oregon Social Science Standards reflect culturally responsive teaching practices? How is it integrated already? So culturally responsive teaching aligns with the updated standards, move to cultivate inclusive social sciences and expand the narrative. It's important and helpful to spend time with the new standards, therefore, the new concepts, which we'll talk about in a moment, and essential disciplinary practices to familiarize yourself with specific examples of how culturally responsive teaching is already showing up in these spaces. So we'll go ahead and look at some of the social science excuse me, sorry about that. We'll look at some of the social science domains and concepts. So across grade levels, the 2024 Oregon Social Science Standards includes 4 concepts per each of its 4 domains. And the domains are different subject areas that fall under social science. So civics, economics, geography, and history, to assist teachers and students in understanding these main ideas in each of the domains. So the bolded concepts you see here on the slide are particularly relevant to culturally responsive teaching, although they are by no means the only concepts that directly relate to culturally responsive teaching practices and allow room for folks to apply those practices. But the ones we highlighted here include identity, roles, and responsibilities under civics, human interactions and interconnections under geography, conflict, cooperation, and communities and pluralism under history. Many of the standards that speak most clearly to culturally responsive teaching practices fall under these 4 concepts, but you'll see throughout as we indicate different standards, you'll see that really it's a robust approach that can be mapped onto any of these concepts, any of these standards. And then we'll look at a few essential disciplinary practices. If you are going through the standards, you would find the essential disciplinary practices on pages 6 through 9, but they really appear over and over throughout at every grade level. So seen here, Oregon's essential disciplinary practice provides a framework for teaching the social sciences. These practices, integrated with the grade level standards, equip students with content knowledge and skills to address systemic injustices, advocate for a more equitable world, and uphold the aspirational ideals of our democratic society, which are important components of culturally responsive teaching and Oregon standards. As such, all 10 of the essential disciplinary practices align with culturally responsive teaching practices. But the 4 that we highlighted here for you are particularly relevant. So we have EDP 4, seek and analyze diverse perspectives to develop a more complete understanding of past and current events. EDP 5, evaluate and assess how discrimination, racism, and inequality create historical narratives, individual perspectives, intersecting identities, and diverse understandings of the past and present. EDP 7, cultivate global awareness and cultural understanding to effectively engage with diverse cultures and perspectives in an interconnected world. And EDP 8, demonstrate empathy to understand how identities shape actions of resistance and resilience among individuals and their communities. We'll also look at some specific standards as well. Culturally responsive teaching concepts align directly with many of the 2024 social science standards. I've simply highlighted a few for you here. So for instance, the culturally responsive practice of fostering students' understanding of self and community aligns with the first grade standard 1HCP4, which calls for examining and understanding self-identity and how it fits with the identities of the family, school, and the local community. And a third grade standard, 3HCP6, which describes how the identity of the local community shapes its history and compares it to other communities in the region. The culturally responsive practice of integrating diverse perspectives, meanwhile, aligns with a middle school standard 6/7 HCP9, which asks that students are able to identify the key components of creation of or origin stories from various civilizations and cultures, and a high school standard, HSCDP13, which calls for students to be able to argue and defend positions on contemporary issues in which foundational ideas or values are in tension. So we have a few more coming up, but you can already see that that crosses the length of, the education system across every grade level and across different topics and contents as well. So additionally, the culturally responsive practice of cultivating understanding of the root causes and effects of biases, stereotypes, prejudices, and discrimination aligns with a fourth grade standard for HCP7 that asks for students to be able to identify and explain how the legacy of colonialism and discrimination based on race, gender, economic, and social group identity created and continues to affect the history, growth, and current experience of residents of Oregon, and a high school standard, HSUS CP16, which asks that students assess the role and consequences of anti-Semitism in the United States. And finally, the culturally responsive practice of building curriculum that is applicable to students' lives aligns with a third grade standard, 3CCE7, identify a local public issue and describe ways individuals and groups can engage with decision makers to have influence in the civic life of their communities. And a middle school standard, 8ES1, compare the education and training requirements, income potential, and primary duties of at least 2 jobs available to high school students. So again, covers a wide range of domains and content areas. And all of them really lend themselves to culturally responsive practices and approaches. So I'll close this out by covering just a couple themes that we're going to highlight here today that will structure our different work that we'll do with you in the different modeling and the different pedagogical strategies and content that we'll ask you to think about. So the culturally responsive themes that we will highlight today are expanding the narrative, communities and pluralism, and change makers in history, conflict and cooperation. For the rest of the session, we'll use these themes to explore rigorous and culturally responsive instructional practices and activities to take back with you to your classrooms and to the schools and the teachers that you work with. We picked these themes based on the aforementioned social science standards, concepts, and interstitial disciplinary practices, but these are just 2 potential ways to group and teach the standards as thematic units. And for our condensed time structure, a thematic approach is helpful. However, in a class where you have the duration of a semester or a school year to cover content, it is important as you come up with different themes and ideas and ways to connect these standards that you always emphasize chronology as well. We want the students to be able to effectively identify and analyze cause and effect. That's a core part of the goals of the 2024 social studies standards. And so we want to ensure that the chronology doesn't get lost in the themes. Another thing to consider is that for K through 5 teachers, which we noticed that a lot of you are here with us today, you have the added pressure to emphasize tested subject areas, and you have to cover all of those with the same students. So it's helpful to integrate lessons with other content area standards. And you will definitely work on that later in the K-5 breakout group. Just to give you something to look forward to, you'll be working with picture books and thinking about how you can combine those standards. But for now, I'll pause and we'll get into some more of that content.
Okay, so to get us ready for our first theme of communities or expanding the narrative, communities and pluralism, we have been talking at you for a little bit. We're going to play a little bit of a game. And as I used to tell my students when I was in the classroom, I do not have a prize, but you are playing for bragging rights. So, get ready. You will either be able to type your responses into the chat, or if you're feeling really brave, we'll invite you to come off mute. But we're going to ask you some questions, give you some identities of some important figures, and see if you can identify who the individual is. So we will go to the next slide. And I want you to try to figure out without Googling who the individual described on the slide is. I will read it to you. As a Shoshone woman, I use my knowledge of the terrain and the languages to aid the Corps of Discovery on their journey. Despite carrying my newborn child, I traveled thousands of miles from the Great Plains to the Pacific Oceans and back. My presence on the expedition was a symbol of peace. As a seeing woman and child, I often reassured indigenous tribes of our peaceful intentions, and I was a crucial guide and translator for the Lewis and Clark expedition, helping them explore the unfamiliar lands of the American West. So if you think you know the answer, you can go ahead and put it in the chat. I see we already have 2 responses that have come in from Ross and Mandy. Someone has co-signed Mandy's response, it looks like. Christina agrees. All right, if anyone else wants to get in a last response in the chat, now is your time. All right, we can advance the slide and see how our contestants did. It is Sacagawea, so very good. To those of you, Ross, I think you were first, so congratulations. Ross, you are the winner for round 1. All right, we have one more round. So those of you who did not offer a response in our first round, now is your chance to redeem yourself and to get some bragging rights. So this one says, as an activist and leader, I helped establish schools for African American children to ensure educational opportunities for children regardless of their race. My work in the mid 1800s focused on advocating for equal rights and supporting the Black community in the Pacific Northwest. I've been identified by the Oregonian as the quote, Frederick Douglass of Oregon. So if you think you know who that individual is, you can enter it in the chat now. Not seeing any responses. People have their thinking hats on. Give another 10 seconds as folks consider who this individual might be. All right, we are going to give you the answer. We can advance to the answer. And this is George Putnam Riley. So a famous individual, noteworthy individual in the Black community in the Pacific Northwest. And the reason, part of the reason anyway, why we decided to play this little game is twofold. One, to really underscore the importance of plurality, right? And knowing and understanding different individuals and different communities who are noteworthy and important to our history. And also really making the case for ensuring that we're teaching students about their local history, right? As Oregon students. And so a lot of the resources, several of the resources that we'll be highlighting this evening, as well as those that will be a part of the resource library that are being co-created between WestEd and ODE, are ones that will feature, very intentionally so, Oregonians, right? And individuals who are important to local history. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Crystal, who's going to talk a bit more about this idea of communities and pluralism. And thank you for playing. Ross, you are still the winner.
Yes, thank you so much, Jackie. We did stump them, but I know one of my favorite things with working with this project has been how much I've learned about Oregon history. So I'm glad to see that it seems other people are learning about that as well. But before we jump into another activity, we wanted to speak a little bit more about why we selected the communities and pluralism theme. This concept expands the narrative in social science, a goal that we talked about with culturally responsive teaching, as well as with the 2024 social science standards. It highlights traditionally underrepresented groups in history to do so. This concept cultivates students' critical thinking by elevating diverse worldviews and fostering students' ability to understand and engage respectfully with varied experiences and perspectives to sustain a pluralistic democracy. It emphasizes the complexity of history through investigating past and present societal issues, creating opportunities for students to recognize and critique dominant narratives, and to understand how bias and discrimination often shapes these narratives. When you incorporate diverse narratives and traditionally underrepresented groups into the curriculum, it is important to integrate these stories together to avoid false divisions between groups. To do so, you can look for common themes, as we do here, across experiences. So for example, we don't recommend isolating Black experiences from Indigenous experiences, but rather sharing how these communities' experiences aligned and overlapped throughout history. And to this end, one thing you could do is look at parallels between the American Indian movement and the Black Power movement into the 1960s and 70s. So this speaks to that idea we were mentioning about using themes and chronology at the same time to tell a more complete story. So one activity that we wanted to demonstrate with you here today is the instructional strategy of silent conversation. You could see an image there of one example of what that might look like done in kind of that gallery walk style. But silent conversation is an instructional tool that can be used to expand the narrative at all grade levels with the appropriate differentiation for the younger students. So how does it work? So students silently write down responses to a stimulus. That stimulus can be a quote, as we see here. It can be an entire document. It can be an image. And then students respond to each other's questions and comments, still silently, as they can take turns looking through this document, this image, this quote. Each individual or group should have a distinct writing utensil, as you see in this image on the slide, so that each response can be more easily matched with its author as you discuss what they have shared and what it's brought up for them. Silent conversation aims to integrate student voices. Even those who are hesitant to participate verbally or volunteer an answer can actively participate through this exercise. It can also easily be modified across grade levels and used to incorporate multiple perspectives, create dialogue between students, and really expand the narrative as we were discussing. It is an effective tool for analyzing primary sources, including images. And analyzing primary sources is a skill highlighted in the essential disciplinary practices. Specifically, it states to collect, interpret, evaluate, and apply information from primary and secondary sources to better understand and create historical narratives distinguishing between fact and opinion. So it's a way for them to analyze a document, but a little bit more interactively. So let's check out an example of how this could be used in the classroom. Albeit this will be a modified virtual example that we can all participate in here today on this Zoom. So I want you to take a moment to review the primary source document before you and think about, what do you notice about this image? Okay, so taking a moment to do that. And when you're ready, you can add your response on the Padlet. The link is in the chat for you, but definitely take a moment before you feel, until you feel ready. In case folks are not familiar with Padlet, haven't used it before, maybe with their students, you can add a comment by clicking the plus on the bottom in the left corner on the Padlet, and then you hit publish after typing your response. But just let us know if you're having any difficulty with the Padlet, and the link is in the chat, but we'll give you a second. We have our first comment. It looks like a passport or some kind of official paperwork. And Nicole noticed the restrictions. Yes. Give another moment so we can get a few more responses from folks. I love the anonymous names here that folks who don't have an account. Happy Lions, White Magpies, noticing a US citizen, or proof of citizenship was provided. Prediction from us, it's an internment camp official document, definite leave. Okay, confirmation open, thank you. All right, thank you for everyone who has shared some thoughts. I'm going to have you take a moment to read and respond to the colleagues' posts on Padlet. So you'll see, it's just as someone was reading out all of the different comments we have here. It's restricted, yes, thank you. So why don't we use, so we have so much to scroll through, I think, on here. Why don't we use the chat on Zoom to comment on anything that you've seen? So again, we're kind of trying to create an interaction similar to the silence activity here, the instructional strategy of silent conversation, so that you're able to interact with one another and react back to the comments that you've seen. So if you feel free to use the Zoom chat to see anything that stuck out to you within your colleagues' comments on the Padlet. This one person's already commented using the Padlet before I made that note and said that they hadn't noticed the year at first, but the year, even if you didn't maybe have some other context, would help suggest that this was related to Japanese incarceration. Exactly. Any other thoughts that you have on what you're seeing there, you can share in the Zoom chat. All right, so I'm gonna share some historical context, even though folks were definitely able to kind of assess some of that and kind of suss it out themselves as well, which I appreciate it. Those are some great noticings. So as a reminder, so we can go ahead to the next slide so I can provide them a little context too. Thank you. So you'll want to select a stimulus that's related to what your students have been learning about in class or what they will be learning about soon if the silent conversation maybe serves as like a hook to grab their interest before a new unit is introduced. But as long as it's not used in that way, the student should otherwise have historical knowledge that helps them contextualize the stimulus or, should provide it to them shortly after if they haven't had that yet. So as some of you noted, this is a primary source document relating to the Japanese incarceration during World War II. So following Japan's 1942 attack on Pearl Harbor, the US government enacted an executive order that forced over 100,000 people of Japanese descent living in Oregon, Washington, California, as well as Southwest Arizona, into incarceration camps located in remote regions away from the coast. So Japanese Americans living in these quote unquote relocation areas needed permission to leave. And this Citizens Indefinite Leave card granted Oregonian George T. Naguma permission to leave Minnetonka, which was an incarceration camp in Idaho. The government justified the incarceration of Japanese Americans as a national security measure, despite lacking evidence of a threat. So unlike Japanese Americans, people of German and Italian descent were not subject to mass-scale government-ordered incarceration during the war. As a result, Japanese American families lived in harsh conditions, lost their property and livelihoods, and suffered long-lasting trauma. You can find more information about this through articles on Oregon Encyclopedia, which will be linked for you or are linked for you already in the workbook. So one thing we wanted to also comment on is how to use this in the K-5 setting. I know that'll be relevant to a lot of you. So to use this activity with elementary school students, we encourage you to make a few modifications. So things like consider using images instead of text, and ideally images without much writing. So unlike this document, which was more well-suited maybe for secondary students, that would of course depend on the particular students in front of you in your room. We also recommend using short and simple prompts like the one that I modeled for you. What do you notice about this image? Right? It's an easy way in for a lot of folks to share their ideas, including students of all ages. You can provide sentence stems as well to help guide their responses, and you can let them use color coding, symbols, stickers, emojis as responses. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the long written ones we saw on our example image on that first slide. Okay. We also suggest maybe providing some longer think time than maybe necessarily what I would model with you as adult learners. I gave you a minute or two, maybe you want to let them sit with it for longer. So in the chat, please let us know if you have any other suggestions. There's a lot of K-5 teachers here. Other ideas for how to make this a friendly activity for elementary aged students. And if you've used this method before, something that's worked for you. Oh, that's a great idea. So Abby, if anyone hasn't seen it in the chat, noted that she did use this activity with third and fourth graders. And so they submitted a post-it note and they did it in teams and in groups or partners. That's great. Mhm. All right, so yeah, we really appreciate hearing from someone like Abby who has used it, someone like Mandy who's thinking about how it could work well for you, for the students that you work with, the teachers you work with. Another thing we were thinking about is maybe like responding in drawings. So kind of going along with that example of using stickers, emojis, something along outside of writing to kind of keep nurturing their curiosity and creativity. All right, we are going to have another example introduce you or deepen some of your practice with another topic in history.
And I think for this one, instead of responding in the Padlet, why don't we try responding in the Zoom chat, which it seems like we've already been doing, and then this way we can respond to one another as well. So this is an image, and if you could just take a moment to look at it, and then instead of responding on the Padlet, after a minute or so, just go ahead and drop your responses into the Zoom chat in terms of what do you notice about this image? What do you see? And then once you've had an opportunity to enter something in the chat in terms of something that you noticed, now let's take a minute or two to respond to something that someone else has said in the chat. And you can do that by either adding an emoji or by adding a sub comment underneath their comment. Okay, so you can see that we have a lot of responses in the chat, both in terms of things that folks noticed as well as reactions to other people's comments. So again, keep this in mind as a strategy that you could use with students or encourage educators that you work with to use with their students. And some really rich discussion and questions that can develop around a single image. Something else that I think this allows you to do as an educator is to see the level of perhaps background knowledge that your students already have about an image. So if you all were my students, clearly I'm able to see just by looking at your responses that individuals have various levels of background knowledge about what this image actually is and what it's depicting. And so that's something to keep in mind as well while you're working with your students. Just to give a bit more context about this image, here's the same image with a description that you could provide to students. If you were working with older elementary students, you could have them read it or you could read it to them. So it reads, the Chiamwa Indian Training School was founded in 1880 in Salem, Oregon, as a federal boarding school for Native American students. It was established to forcibly assimilate Indigenous students into mainstream U.S. society, primarily through education and vocational training. The school is a part of the U.S. government's policy to erase Native cultures and languages, promoting Western-style education. By 1924, the Chimwa resembled a small town. Because Native children were denied educational opportunities elsewhere, some families chose to send their children to the school. It still operates today, albeit with a mission of cultural sustainment and academic excellence, which is a far cry from from its origins. And so, for more information on this, you can actually visit the Oregon Encyclopedia, which is a great resource that has a lot of information about Indian boarding schools, where you can learn more. And so something to think about if you were to use this with students is what type of background knowledge would students need to have or would you need to provide them with? And how would you structure that for the classroom setting? Another thing that I'm just going to invite us to think about, and if anyone wants to come off mute to share, we'd love to hear from you. But how would you modify this activity for a K-5 classroom in particular? So just reading Carrie said in the chat, one question I might ask K-5 students could be around what in this picture is similar or different from our school to give kids a chance to locate the children in the picture as real. And I love that suggestion, right? So giving children an opportunity to relate to or identify with what they see. Absolutely. Is there anything else that folks would do to modify or even to set up a lesson or a activity like this with K-5 learners? Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing how you've used that image with your students as an example of how children lost their language and lost some of their cultural identity by going to these schools. Yeah, thank you so much for naming that. And for those who didn't get a chance to see the comment in the chat earlier, I actually put a heart around it, but thank you so much for elevating it again. And I just want to kind of restate, right, this idea that Christina brought to the group, right? The importance of using trauma-informed teaching practices, and also want to highlight that Oregon ODE is also working simultaneously on rolling out these 2024 social science standards on an initiative to bring the transformative social emotional learning framework to educators and students across the state. And so, what we're going to attempt to do this evening and in future sessions, as well as in those regional summits that Amit mentioned at the top of the session, is to really intentionally integrate the social science standards with the T-cell, the transformative social emotional learning framework, right? Because much to your point, Christina, it is really important that we're doing these things together, right? And that we're making sure that students as well as adults are supported and are prepared to engage in this learning, because some of it does bring up some painful memories and some things that don't seem like distant memories, that seem very present to what is going on in our world at the present. So we'll go ahead to the next slide. Um, Many of these we've already touched on, you all have already mentioned, so we won't spend too much time here, but just some considerations for application. When you're applying these standards, start with your students, right? Start with their backgrounds, their prior knowledge and experiences. Choose sources that connect to what they already know, because that is going to make the learning more meaningful. Be intentional with the images that you're using. So avoid violent imagery, especially of historically underrepresented groups. That's damaging not only to children from historically underrepresented groups, but also has impacts and implication on children who are not from those groups, right? So just be really mindful of the images that you're selecting. And instead highlight things like agency, resilience, and contributions that underrepresented groups have made. Also, scaffold questions to support engagement. So, a great strategy aligned with Oregon's T-cell standards is using a like "What's it to me?" reflection question. So things such as, what terms are unfamiliar to me? What do I recognize? How does this connect with what I already know? What questions do I have? And I love the question that someone from our group, Christina, I think you mentioned, right? Is like, how is this similar to, or how are these children similar to me, right? So allowing students to make that personal connection. And this helps students process the information, make connections, and really take ownership of their own learning. So next we're going to start to think about the connections to the standards for that set of activities that we just engaged in. So connecting the standards to essential disciplinary practices for an activity like this is also really important. So in terms of the connections to the standards, they're pretty clear connections, and you'll recognize these, I think, right away from some of the things that we talked about at the top of our session. So some pretty clear connections to history standards around communities and pluralism for grade 4, as well as conflict and cooperation for grade 5. Human and environmental interaction, right? So thinking about some of the geography specific standards in the domain of geography. So identifying and describing examples of conquest and colonialism in North America and how that affected Indigenous peoples' identities and cultures and communities. As well as examining the perspectives of survivors of Indigenous genocide, Black communities who were impacted by violence and other human rights violations, using primary sources from multiple perspectives. And I think those images that we saw are really great examples of primary sources that you can use with some of your elementary learners as well as secondary learners. In terms of how the activity that we just engaged in is related to the essential disciplinary practices highlighted in the 2024 standards, here we can see that they are related to essential disciplinary practices like the third one, which is collecting, interpreting, and evaluating and applying information from primary and secondary sources. Also seeking and analyzing diverse perspectives to develop a more complete understanding of the past. And lastly, evaluating and assessing how discrimination, racism, and inequality create historical narratives and individual perspectives, etc. And so these may seem like really challenging and rigorous disciplinary practices for secondary and for elementary students to grasp. But I think with careful planning and developmentally appropriate pedagogical practices, students in elementary and secondary classrooms can master these essential disciplinary practices for social science, right? And that's what the standards are ultimately working to help students do. So now that we've talked about the standards and seen some examples of them, as well as the essential disciplinary practices, and kind of gotten our feet wet with some of the ways that you can start to incorporate them into your classrooms, we are going to take a quick break, give folks a chance to stretch your legs, take a bio break, and then we'll come back in just about 5 minutes. So, like 14 after, we will start back up and eventually work our way into some breakout rooms for secondary folks and for elementary folks. So why don't we take 5 and come back at just about 14 after. Crystal and myself will be on to answer questions that you may have in the chat, or if anyone wants to come off mute.
Hey, welcome back, folks. We'll go ahead and set you up with the groundwork for what we'll be doing with change makers in history, conflict and cooperation, our second theme of the evening. So I'll go ahead and explain why change makers. Why did we settle on this theme? So as we teach about the oppression and discrimination that historically underrepresented groups endured throughout history to the present, it is important to present the totality of a people's narrative. So expanding the narrative really means presenting the full story, highlighting historically underrepresented groups' agency and strength alongside their suffering. To this end, the section of Changemakers in History will focus on why and how to teach authentic stories of resilience thoughtfully and respectfully. And I'm happy to say that some of that conversation, is already coming up through our chat and participation, which I was happy to hear. And this will reveal how conflict can lead to cooperation or resistance and activism through a focus on historical changemakers. And this theme does appear across the social science standards. We see the changemakers theme frequently showing up. So we just highlighted a few examples of that. And you'll see kind of bolded as well in the examples where I saw exact things we'd be using today. So I wanted to draw your attention to some of that. The following 2 standards will be covered in the K-5 breakout room. And that is KHCC2, you see there. It calls for identifying examples in stories and biographies or other primary and secondary sources of unfairness or injustice, and the change makers who are working for a better world in response to that. This 3rd grade standard that you see highlighted necessitates describing how individuals and groups in the local community and region function as change makers. And the next 2 standards that will be covered will be in the 6 through 12 breakout room. On these 2 high school standards, the first one, USCP 14, aims to examine the perspectives of survivors of human rights violations, such as the genocide of Indigenous communities in the United States, or what is now the United States, as well as Black communities. And using primary sources to tell these stories through multiple perspectives, and survivor testimonies included. And USCP 19, which is focused on identifying and analyzing political, social, and intellectual movements in the post-World War II US, and thinking about challenging discrimination and traditional assumptions through those movements. And then I'll speak a little bit more about the framework and its purpose and the theme, and how can use some of the existing documents that we've created to support professional learning to delve a little bit deeper than maybe this time slot allows for us in one session. So to delve deeper, we recommend exploring the curricular analysis framework. The framework is a tool to support educators in selecting and adapting materials that align with the 2024 social science standards. It provides guidance for ensuring resources are historically accurate, culturally responsive, and inclusive of diverse voices and perspectives. So in other words, it's grounded in the concepts that we were discussing in this session, and it can support you as you apply a culturally responsive approach to your instructional practice. The framework is a robust tool, so you can implement this framework comprehensively or focus on specific categories to refine areas of your practice, such as ensuring historical accuracy and including diverse voices. The framework supports both individual planning, but then also team-based implementation, so whether that be professional learning communities or department meetings. And when used collaboratively, the framework facilitates shared reflection, consistent practices across classrooms, and collective commitment to high quality teaching and learning. So you'll find the link to this document, this fantastic resource, in two places. It's been dropped in the chat for you and also placed into the workbook that we provided at the beginning. So we hope that you will spend some time going through that document. Did we lose the slides for a minute? All right. We are going to transition in just a moment to breakout groups. But before we do that, I want to give you just a little bit more information on how we think we can make those the most successful. So I think if the slides back up there, we can go ahead to the next slide there. Yes, that'd be perfect. The slide we were just shown is just another example of what is included with the framework. So you all will have some time to investigate that on your own for sure, and we hope you do. As for the breakout groups, we'll be breaking out in gray band groups to dive further into the standards by grade level. So in this session, we'll model a sequence of activities related to this changemakers theme using standards that I just showed to you. So with K-5 and then in the secondary, middle and high school levels. In breakout groups, we will also ask you to engage as both educators and then students/learners. So there are moments where we'll step back and we'll reflect on our practices and ask you to reflect on yours as well. But for the most part, we want to see how you can put yourselves in the shoes of your students and notice how these resources and activities are building skills in addition to content knowledge. We want to take a moment too to remind you about the norms of engagement we discussed in the beginning of this session. So please, allow for space for equitable participation, engage in curiosity-led discussions, and demonstrate mutual respect for one another. And many participants who attended session 1 indicated that engaging with their colleagues in breakout groups was one of the more fruitful parts of the professional learning session. We've also heard from our need sensing groups that they want to talk to each other. You want to talk to other educators throughout the state. And I know this is a rare opportunity to learn from and with colleagues, not just that you work with on a regular basis, but throughout cities and counties around your state. So we are excited to lead you through these activities. And we truly believe that if you are active, you're engaged, you're participating, it'll make the great breakout groups so much better for each of you. We'll create breakout groups now. And yes, we'll create those breakout groups for you. Please join in the K through 5 room, you'll be with Jackie, and then in the 6 through 12 room, you'll be with me. We do know, as Jackie has noted, in the chat, that there are people who are K through 12, so we're trying to balance those numbers out. So you might be placed into one or the other.
So, okay, let me get my slides back up here. So this next theme that we're looking at in our respective breakout groups is all about change makers, and like how we teach these authentic stories of resilience and resistance in a thoughtful and respectful way. So two of the questions that we'll be really focusing on, and we can go to the next slide, is how can someone create change? And how have change makers challenged discrimination, racism, and oppression? And so we're going to be focusing on those two questions in a way that is particular to or specific to our K through 5 learners. I also want to acknowledge just at the top, especially because either we're all like K-5 educators or supporting K-5 educators, that I know that social science isn't always a standalone subject. And so you or your teachers are probably integrating this work into maybe like an ELA block, or people might just be teaching it once a week rather than something that's daily and incorporated into students kind of every day. And that's okay. So as we discuss these things, think about how these questions can connect across subject areas and fit into the instructional time that you have. So our agenda for our time in breakouts today is we're going to do a model lesson overview. We'll be talking specifically about picture book modeling and doing some primary source analysis. So we'll be doing a see, think, wonder activity. And then we'll talk about diverse voices through a lesson setup called a circle of perspectives or a circle of viewpoints. And then we'll discuss additional activities as time allows. So you wouldn't be able to fit all of the things that we're going to be doing in our breakout group into a single lesson if you're working with elementary school students, but we're going to just explore several things that you could do that are aligned with the new standards. And then obviously you can feel, free to adapt them to your specific learners or your specific contexts. So we can go to the next slide. Yeah, these are related to the K-5 social science. These are the related, rather, the relevant K-5 social science standards. So just take a minute to skim through them. You wouldn't necessarily share these with students, but these are the standards that the lessons that we'll be modeling would be anchored in. So these three. And we can go to the next slide. And then these are the essential disciplinary practices relevant to this particular lesson. So developing questions for social science inquiry, collecting, interpreting, and evaluating primary and secondary sources, demonstrating empathy to understand how identities shape actions of resistance and resilience, seeking and analyzing diverse perspectives, right? Again, because we want students to get that complete understanding of the past, and then historical narratives and individual perspectives. So a lot of disciplinary practices or of the essential disciplinary practices can be covered in the lessons or in the samples that we're going to do in our breakout. So we can go to the next slide. And this would be something that you would do as a pre-reading activity with your students. So we're going to be taking a look in just a moment at a picture book and modeling. I'll be modeling for you the use of children's literature using a biography about Harvey Milk. It's a picture book called Pride, the Story of Harvey Milk and the Rainbow Flag by Rob Sanders. It connects to history standards for third grade for local change makers. So using children's literature, and again, this is a biography, and picture books can be a really effective strategy to use with some of our younger learners, as well as some of our secondary students. For the pre-reading analysis, I might ask students, what do they know about Harvey Milk? What do they know about the rainbow flag? Have they ever seen it before? Looking at the cover of the book, who do you think this person was? Do you think that he was important? What do you think that he may have done, or what might have been his job? And then during reading, there are some things that I might pause to ask my students as well, right? So some of the comprehension questions during the read aloud. Obviously, if you had this book, if it was something that you checked out from the library, you would do those pauses on your own. Or if you were using the video, which I'm going to show you in just a moment, you could pause the video at certain points to ask your students those comprehension questions or to allow them to interrupt and ask their questions that they may have. So I will say before starting the video, which we'll do on the next slide, this is actually a book that I use with my own learners at home. So my own two children in preparing for this evening's session. I have a first grader and a third grader. And they had really, really insightful questions and some very interesting questions, some of which I hadn't even necessarily imagined that they would ask. And so just be thinking as you're watching the read aloud, and also feel free to, I would encourage you to maybe jot down some notes in your workbook of things that you might either ask your students during this read aloud if you were to use this book, or questions that you think that your students might have if they were reading this, right? What are some things that you think may come up during this story? After we watch the video, we'll have some time to debrief and reflect as a group, and then we'll move on to the next model lesson. Okay? Any questions about kind of what to look for or what to do while the video is showing? All right, we can go ahead and start it. It's about 7 minutes. Feel free to turn your camera off if you would like, and to jot down notes.
Hey everyone, I'm author Rob Sanders coming to you from the Tampa Bay, Florida area. And I'm here today to read one of my nonfiction books to you, Pride, the Story of Harvey Milk and the Rainbow Flag. The illustrations are by Steven Salerno, and I'm pleased to be able to show those to you as I read you the story. Harvey Milk was an ordinary man, but he had an extraordinary dream. That dream would change history. Harvey dreamed that everyone, even gay people, would have equality. He dreamed that he and his friends would be treated like everyone else. He dreamed that one day people would be able to live and love as they pleased. With his New York accent, Harvey talked to everyone about his dream. His voice boomed, his body bounced with energy and excitement. Some people listened, a few agreed, most did not. But Harvey's big voice and his big dream wouldn't be stopped. He discovered that the best way to change laws was to help make laws. In 1977, Harvey Milk took a big step toward that dream when he became one of the first openly gay people to be elected to political office in the United States. Harvey and his friends planned marches to protest inequality and unfair laws. And just days before one of the marches, Harvey had an idea. A symbol, he thought. We need a symbol that shows who we are and how we feel. Something to carry during the march. Something to make people feel they're part of a community. Something to give people hope. Something extraordinary. Harvey knew an artist who could help, Gilbert Baker. Harvey asked, Gilbert said, "We need a flag." Volunteers arrived to help Gilbert's design come to life. Together, they dipped fabric into large barrels filled with vivid, vibrant dyes. They cut and pieced and sewed until Harvey, Gilbert, and the other activist had a flag with 8 colorful stripes, a flag that Harvey hoped would give hope. On June 25th, 1978, when it was time for the march, a breeze stirred in San Francisco. The flag unfurled. The wind blew. The flag fluttered, flapped, and flew, a rainbow as bright and unique as the men and women who walked behind it led the march. Harvey and the people asked for equality. They asked to be treated like everyone else. They asked to live and love as they pleased. They hoped the march would make a difference. Harvey was proud of the flag and proud of himself. He hoped others could be proud too. 5 months later, on the morning of November 27, 1978, Harvey and the mayor of San Francisco, George Moscone, were assassinated. Their lives were lost to a man who did not think like Harvey, or feel like him, or love like him. The flag did not fly on that dark, sad night. Instead, thousands and thousands of people marched silently, carrying candles. The candlelight wove through the streets of San Francisco, up and down hills and around city buildings. A mile of glowing candlelight in honor of a dream. That could have been the end of Harvey's dream and the colorful flag, but it wasn't. More rainbow flags were created. Some of the colors changed. 8 stripes became 6 stripes. But the meaning of the flag did not change. It was a flag of equality. More and more people began to think of the flag as their flag, and they began to feel pride. They began to have hope. In 1994, Gilbert Baker designed another rainbow flag. This one was larger than all the rest. Women and men side by side carried the flag, a proud mile-long rainbow floating through New York City. The flag wove through the streets, up and down avenues and boulevards and around city buildings. The people demanded equality. They demanded to be treated like everyone else. They demanded to live and love as they pleased. They were proud. They had hope. More rainbow flags were made. Some were printed on bumper stickers and t-shirts. Others were hoisted onto lampposts on Halsted Street in Chicago. One was hung in the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. Soon the rainbow flag was flying in other countries like Brazil, England, Israel, Russia, Singapore, and Turkey. The rainbow flag now unfurled on farms, in suburbs, and in cities. The flag flew proudly outside public buildings, hotels, shops, restaurants, churches, and homes. And once, on June 26, 2015, the White House was awash in the colors of the rainbow flag. Equality, pride, hope, love. Harvey's dream became a flag for us all.
Okay, and so we can actually take a moment to stop sharing the slides. So during reading this book, if you had the book, and if you didn't, if you wanted to use the video of the read aloud and pause the video, some things that you might ask your students during the reading are, what are people saying about Harvey and other people who are gay? And why do you think that people in the story are acting that way? And how do you think that Harvey's feeling, right? So this is an opportunity to have your students practice a bit of empathy, right, for some of the characters in the story. Why was Harvey's leadership important, and why was the flag important at that time? And why is it important to stand up for what is right, even when it's difficult, or to stand up for people who are being mistreated? In terms of post-reading, you could revisit the thematic questions. So how can someone create change, right? How can someone be a change maker? And how have change makers, in this instance, Harvey Milk, how they challenge discrimination, racism, or oppression? And then lastly, one of the other things that we talked about, which is captured on the next slide, is the fact that as educators, it's really essential that we deepen our own understanding of the topics that we teach before we teach them to children. Especially if they're topics that are new to us. So when I was first introduced to this resource or this book, as an example, a lot of this I didn't actually know, right? I had seen the rainbow flag before, but I didn't know a lot of the history behind it. And so building our background knowledge helps us feel more confident in teaching our students, and it also ensures that we present information accurately and thoughtfully. And so for those who are looking to learn more about the history of LGBTQ plus rights, in Oregon, there are 2 resources that I'll just kind of lift up and draw your attention to. One is the Gay Lesbian Rights Movement from the Oregon Encyclopedia. And another is the No on 9 Remembered from the Western States Center. And both of these resources provide valuable context and historical perspective to support your teaching. And while they might not be resources that you would use directly with students, they're certainly ones that are really helpful for educators and for adults in building some of that background knowledge. So the next activity we're going to go to is a primary source activity called See, Think, and Wonder. And this is another activity that you might want to try with your students as a pedagogical approach. You're probably already familiar with this or have done something similar to this before, the See, Think, Wonder approach. So this is when essentially you would ask your students, what do you see? What do you notice? And then to think, so what do you think about what you see and what can you infer from what you see? And then to do a bit of wondering, right? So what does this make you wonder and what would you like to learn, right? What do you want to know more about? So we're going to look at a few different examples of primary sources that you could use to do a see, think, and wonder activity. We may not have time to thoroughly analyze all three during our breakout group time because we want to make sure that we're respecting everyone's time this afternoon and finishing up on time. Before we move to our kind of last example called Circle of Viewpoints, where we'll talk about how you could use these different primary sources all together to do an activity called a Circle of Viewpoints. So on the next slide is an example of a primary source that you could use as a part of a Changemakers unit. This photograph shows members of Oregon's first Black Panther Party speaking at the University of Oregon in the late 1960s. They were supporting Black student protests at Oregon State University. And so this is where you might ask students to, consider the context, right? Or you would consider the context before using something like this. So think about, what do your students know about the Black Panthers? If anything, what do you know about the Black Panthers? What might you need to understand about this time period? And the location of where the photograph is from in order to fully interpret it. So why don't we just take a moment to look at the picture and then we'll do a little kind of mini see, think, wonder, and feel free to put responses into the chat. So what do you see? What do you notice? What do you think this is about, or what do you think is going on? And what does it make you wonder, or what would you like to know more about? And you can feel free to put things directly into the chat, or you can come off mute and share anything that you see, think, or are wondering about this photograph. Someone else has put in the chat, it looks like there are several members of the Black Panther blocking access to what I think might be a protest. And then someone wondering, I wonder how many people were there. Yeah, that's a great question. If we could zoom out, like how big is the crowd of people, right? So someone else saying, I see a group of people standing in front of a speaker. I wonder if they're protecting the speaker. It also makes me wonder what the speaker is saying, right? Like, because this is an audio recording, right? So we don't know what this individual might be saying, right? Okay. So now let's add some historical context to this photo. And this is something that is important, right, to understand more of what's going on here. So Oregon's first Black Panther Party was active in Eugene from 1968 to 1970. Some members were University of Oregon students and a part of the Black Student Union at the university. Like Black Panther chapters across the country, they work to address issues in the Black community by organizing free breakfast programs for children and offering medical and dental care. But despite these community efforts, the FBI declared the Black Panther Party a national security threat. So before we move on, was any of that kind of additional context new information for anyone? And does that information help give any more context to what might be going on in the photo? One of the interesting things, if you, and again, I encourage folks to go to the Oregon Encyclopedia or other resources that we'll share in just a moment to get more information. The Black Panther Party, not only in Oregon, but also in California, started actually like the first school breakfast program, like before there was a federal school breakfast program. They kind of laid the foundation for that initiative or for that practice for school children. So yeah, it was new information for me a little while ago as well. Yeah. Okay. So again, this is an activity that you could use with your students. Um, and also it's important to, kind of ask yourself not only what do you know about, the Black Panther Party, but what do your students know, right? And how does what they know or don't know, how might that shape the way that they're interpreting these images or these primary sources? We are going to do, I think we have time for one more. Maybe two more. We'll see how many we get to. Um, so this is another primary source of the American Indian Movement, or AIM. And this is a photo of Indian protesters took over the Portland offices at the Bonneville Power Administration in August 1975. And this is a photo from the Oregon Historical Society. So again, let's do the same thing, a see, think, wonder. And you can put your responses in the chat. What do you see happening here? What do you think, and what does it make you wonder or want to know more about? Okay, so we see some folks wondering what are the protesters' names? And we see that someone's standing on a desk, it looks like, on a desk or a chair, but standing on something. And we're wondering, why is this person doing that? Someone else wondering what's happening that caused the protesters to take over the BPA offices. So what events led to this event, right? What precipitated this? Someone else wondering, what are they protesting? Does it have to do with the dam or fish or land? Interesting. I had not thought of that. So that it sounds like maybe some additional context here that you're bringing into analyzing this photograph. Okay. So let's take a deeper look at some additional context on the next slide. So this again is from the Oregon History Project, and it says office takeovers and other acts of civil disobedience were common tactics among Indian activists during the 1960s and 1970s. 2 years after the occupation of Wounded Knee, federal officers engaged AIM members in a firefight on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, resulting in the death of 2 FBI agents and 24-year-old Joseph Stuntz. The August 1975 takeover of the BPA office and the 6-day march from Olympia, Washington that preceded the takeover were organized in response to the killing of Stuntz. The protesters involved in the action demanded, quote, an end to the undeclared state of martial law in South Dakota, unquote, as well as restitution for his widow. So this additional context answers some of our questions, right? But we can see that with an activity like this, where we're starting with a photograph, right, where we're starting with a primary source, we're giving students an opportunity to get their wheels turning, right, to ask some of those questions about what's going on here, right? Why is someone standing on a desk? Why did they take over this office? What are the names, right? What led to this event or to this image that we see, right? And starting to do some of that inquiry to really get engaged in the history rather than just telling them, oh, there's this thing that happened, right? Here's this event or here's something that happened, right? This is really giving them a chance to dig into it a little more deeply. Okay, the last activity that we are going to explore is something called Circle of Viewpoints. And the Circle of Viewpoints routine helps students to understand or to rather identify different perspectives that could be present in or affected by what one has just read, seen, or heard. It also helps students explore one perspective in further detail and explain their reasoning, as well as get some practice asking questions from a different perspective. So how does it work? So taking on a specific perspective, students use sentence stems to express the beliefs, concerns, and reasoning of that viewpoint as a way to foster empathy and critical thinking. So students get to share and reflect on the diverse perspectives and deepen their understanding of complex issues. So why would you use an activity like this? We can go to the next slide. Yeah. So why use Circle of Viewpoints? First of all, it's a valuable tool for introducing complex historical as well as current topics. It gives the opportunity to emphasize diverse perspectives and historically underrepresented groups, right? So it's directly related to the standards as well as to those essential disciplinary practices. And it helps students build discussion skills, empathy and understanding, critical thinking, as well as writing skills and writing about primary sources. So it can be used to really address a lot of different things. So we're going to do a bit of a Circle of Viewpoints activity. Here's how you might set this up with students. First, you would introduce the material and the topic, right? You would identify the different viewpoints. So you could either generate a list of viewpoints or provide students with those viewpoints. You would explore each viewpoint. So individuals or groups of students could select a different viewpoint to explore. That you would introduce sentence stems for students. So, for example, describe the topic from the perspective of the viewpoint, right? So give students a chance to do some thinking through the perspective or through the viewpoint of a particular group. Have them question what might be puzzling or curious, and then have an opportunity to share with the class, either as a small group or a whole class, or you could have them engage in a short writing prompt. These are some discussion prompts that you could use with your students. So I'm thinking of this event or issue from the viewpoint of blank. I think this because, and then a question or concern that I have from this viewpoint is blank. So here are the 3 viewpoints that by now you're familiar with based on what we've done so far in our breakout group. In a moment, I'm going to ask you to select, and with your students, you might assign one of these viewpoints or you might have them self-select based on their own interest. But in a moment, you're going to select one of these viewpoints to engage with. So take a moment to kind of in your mind, decide which of these viewpoints you would like to adopt for the purpose of this activity. Either the American Indian Movement students, the Eugene Black Panther Party, or Harvey Milk from our read aloud. And then on our next slide, while adopting the stance of the community changemaker that you selected, so either Harvey Milk, one of the members of the Eugene Black Panther Party, or one of the members of the American Indian Movement, you're going to try out using some of these sentence stems. So I'm thinking of this topic from the viewpoint of so-and-so, whoever you selected. I believe this, right? Because of this. And then a question or concern from my viewpoint is, and then you fill in the blank. So again, these aren't necessarily things that you personally think or believe, but you're like putting yourself in the shoes of one of these change makers. And we'll drop in a link to a Padlet where you can jot down your responses. And then we'll have an opportunity to see each other's responses and do a bit of sharing out. Is everybody able to access the Padlet link? Okay, great. So let's head over there to the Padlet. Take a few minutes to jot down your responses, and then we'll do a debrief of this activity. So if let's take the like Harvey Milk example, right? So if I'm thinking of a topic of people being treated fairly, right? And I'm trying to imagine something that like a K through 5 student would say, right? They're not going to say like marriage equality because they're in second grade. But they're saying, I'm thinking about people being treated fairly from the viewpoint of Harvey Milk. And I believe that everybody should be treated fairly, even if they're gay, because I think it's mean to not treat people nicely because they love different people, right? And a question or concern I have from my viewpoint is what can we do if people are being mean to people who are gay? Right? So that's something that like I could imagine a second grader saying, right? And their second grade speak.
Yeah.
Does that
Yeah,
help
that's
you
very
out?
helpful. Yeah,
Okay.
thanks.
Yep. why don't we take about 2 more minutes? If you're not able to jot down a response for like all three of the prompts, maybe just try out one. Okay, and so I'm seeing some responses come in. Excited Aardvark, you are an exemplary and gifted elementary student in your sample response. So thinking about the standpoint or taking the viewpoint of one of the American Indian movement protesters, saying, I'm concerned about the ongoing impacts of the US government on my nation's inherent sovereignty. Sovereignty is definitely a big vocab word for elementary school students, but a super important one for us to help kiddos understand and make sense of what that means, right? Um, and then someone taking the viewpoint of a member of the Eugene Black Panther Party saying, I'm thinking about the Eugene Black Panthers in the viewpoint of an African American person, and I'm curious about other impacts that they've made to help fight for African American rights. And then taking the viewpoint of Harvey Milk as a change maker, someone taking the kid view of, I'm wondering why are people so upset about people or boys loving boys or girls loving girls, right? So a question that a student may very well ask. And so it can be really difficult to kind of put ourselves in the mind of a elementary school student, but it's really important, right, to try to practice that cognitive empathy, right, with our students and try to imagine how they might understand or experience this lesson, as well as give them the opportunity to adopt the viewpoint of someone else, right, and start to wrestle with some of these topics and wonderings. So we're almost out of time, but we'll just quickly wrap up. Let's go directly to slide 66. So we can skip one more ahead. Awesome. So as we wrap up, let's just sort of review some of the key strategies for applying these ideas in your classroom. First, it's really important to be aware of your students' backgrounds and prior knowledge when you're selecting these sources. This ensures that materials are accessible and relevant to their experiences and also helps you know what additional context may you need to build, right? Might you need to provide kiddos with before you introduce these sources or as you introduce these sources. Also consider the impact of an image. So visuals can be really powerful, and so it's important to choose images that are thoughtful and purposeful, particularly when addressing sensitive topics. And then lastly, it's important to scaffold questions and guide students in their analysis and reflection, right? So they're not going to know everything, right? We're going to need to ask them additional levels and layers of questioning. That's actually something that we're going to be talking more about in our third virtual professional learning session coming up in just a few weeks. And then also provide opportunities for students to connect with the materials by using the kind of like, what's it to me reflection questions, right? So helping students to see the relevance of what they're learning. And you can do this by asking questions like, what terms are unfamiliar to me and what terms do I recognize? How does this connect with what I already know? And what questions do I still have? And these simple prompts can help students engage personally with the content and foster connections to the material. And lastly, you don't have to know all of the answers as the educator. So if at the end of this lesson, your students have generated some really rich wonderings and questions that they want to do some further exploration around, that's okay, right? That's something that you can continue to explore in your classroom or even share with parents, right? Or as these are some of the questions that came up, And as the teacher, I'm not going to be able to answer all of them, but I want you to know that these are some of the things that our learners and that your children are thinking about. And you might want to continue these conversations at home. So thank you so much for engaging in our breakout group. We're gonna rejoin the other group in just a moment. So just about 1 minute. So if you want to like stretch your legs, take a bio break, we will meet back in the other room with the other half of our group and we will wrap up. But thank you so much for your attention and for really engaging with this content today.
But welcome back. We hope that the breakout groups were meaningful for all of you. We do have another session tomorrow, so I think we definitely learned some things about what felt the most, valuable to folks and how to create more space for that for tomorrow. So we thank you all for that. We'll close out with some important information for you, including additional professional learning tools and opportunities. But first, we want to do a final check-in by a waterfall chat. So if folks are familiar with that, that's when we ask a question, which we'll put in the chat for you in just a moment. And you kind of type up your response, but you wait until we say go to enter it. And then like the responses come kind of at once, like a waterfall coming down, which I guess is very apt for Pacific Northwest educators. So we will have you take a moment to consider the following question, which is on the slide, and then we'll also be in the chat for you. Based on what you learned today, what is your next step in preparing to implement or to deepen, if you're already implementing, culturally responsive teaching practices aligned with Oregon social science standards? And I know that not everyone here is in the classroom. Maybe you're supporting teachers, you're instructional coach, so apply the question to your context as relevant. You can type your response in the chat, but like I said, don't hit enter yet because we want them to kind of all come together so we can take time collectively to read through those and see what folks are saying. So we'll just do a minute, a little bit less than a minute, just to think through those. Questions on in the chat and on the slide.
Share. Should we put our responses in the
In the chat.
chat?
And give people 5 more seconds and then I will announce the waterfall is coming. All right, so based on what you learned today, what is your next step in preparing to implement culturally responsive teaching practices aligned with Oregon social science standards? Please go forth and waterfall your responses into the chat, hit enter. Okay. Please, yeah, take a moment, interact with, you can respond to, or just emoji response to what your colleagues, to what was said, what everyone's saying in the chat. Yes. I'm sure people in Jackie's K-5 group got to hear that, but she's been checking out books and reading them with her family and really utilizing these tools, which has been so wonderful. Yes, I see a few people mention like local, like Oregon-based things. We have a ton of those resources in some of our online training modules and things coming in our resource hub. So please, take advantage of those collections and please read about those. There's a lot of really amazing work being done in Oregon and folks collecting that work and sharing about it through organizations and museums. So thank you again. And the other thing I want to plug before we move on and close out is the QR code here for a brief survey to provide us feedback with this on the session. And I do mean brief, really, really brief, right? Just takes a minute or two. And it's really important to developing effective professional learning to get your feedback so we continue to improve them, not just in the future, but we do have sessions, coming up that we want to be able to incorporate your feedback into to make sure your voices are heard. So Colleen has dropped that link in the chat. So please take the time to fill that out. Maybe hold off on it for just a moment if you are, because I know Jackie has some important resources and things to talk to us about.
Yeah. We can go to the next slide as you follow that link in the chat to complete the very brief survey. But we wanted to alert you to some more professional learning and resources that we have coming soon. So there will be several Canvas modules. These are self-paced, asynchronous modules that will be released in the next several months that educators can engage in sort of at their own pace to help learn more about the standards as well as just engage with and learn more about some of the content as it's related to the standards. We also have additional virtual professional learnings coming up. We mentioned those at the top of the session, and we'll put the information in the chat again to sign up for and register for our future sessions. So we have 3 more coming up. I think that's right. And then we also have several statewide summits. So our first one just wrapped up yesterday in Pendleton, but we are excited to be coming to you in the next several weeks in Bend, Eugene, and Clackamas. So we hope to see you there. Please register for those and encourage your colleagues and friends to do the same. And then lastly, ODE will be making available an online resource hub with additional professional learning materials, including vetted social science instructional materials and resources, fact sheets and toolkits that can be used both within your school building or education service district and with families and community members, as well as the curriculum analysis framework and an instructional review tool that you got to preview this evening or this afternoon. So lots of stuff coming to you soon. And we hope to see you online again or in Oregon. All right. If you have additional questions and comments, you can share them at that link there. And thank you so much for engaging with us today. We really appreciate it, and it's been great to have the time with you.